The text I'm going to share is from the Gospel of John, chapter 4. It's the story of the woman at the well and Jesus. And rather than, it's 30 verses, I don't want to take the time to read the entire thing, but it begins with Jesus and his disciples deciding to go to Samaria on their way back to Jerusalem and to stop. And it was noon, and the disciples went to town to get some food. Jesus was left alone at the well, and there was a woman from Samaria at this well. And Jesus and this woman began to speak to each other. He asks her for a drink. She's surprised that he, being a Jew, would ask her, a Samaritan woman, because the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along, that Jesus would ask them. They get into a conversation. And then all of a sudden, Jesus says this, kind of out of nowhere. He says, "Go, call your husband and come back." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." And Jesus said to her, "You're right, saying, 'I have no husband,' for you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is not your husband. What you've said is true." And the woman said to him, "Sir, I see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you say that the place where people must worship is in Jerusalem." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when you'll worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeks such as these to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship God must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he comes, he will proclaim all things to us." Jesus said to her, "I'm he, the one who's speaking to you." Just then his disciples came, and they were astonished that he was speaking with a woman. But no one said, "What do you want?" or "Why are you speaking with her?" Then the woman left her water jar and went back to the city. She said to the people, "Come and see a man who told me everything I've ever done. He cannot be the Messiah, can he?" And they left the city and were on their way to him. Well, I get halfway through that reading and I'm actually regretting that I didn't read the whole thing, because I left out what is part of an important part of this exchange that probably shouldn't be left out. And that is Jesus asking the woman for water, and she says, "You don't have a bucket," or whatever. And at first they're talking about a bucket and down in the well. And finally, Jesus says to him, "If you knew who was speaking to you, you would ask me and I'd give you water and you'd never be thirsty again." And she says, "Yeah, I want that water." So they were talking about the deepest source of thirst. Okay, so much for trying to save time by not reading the whole thing, huh? This sermon series, Who is Jesus?, has led me back to 2 of my favorite books. One I mentioned last week by a scholar named Marcus Borg, called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. It's a beautiful modern scholar's take on who Jesus is. The other one is by Cynthia Bourgeau, and it's called The Wisdom Jesus. And I have a feeling I will be referring to both of those books a good deal in the weeks to come. But I strongly suggest, if you're hungry to know more about Jesus, that both of these books, and contact me, I'll give you the info for the books. Both of them suggest that it's important, if we really want to know who Jesus is, to try to somehow let go of what we know, a lot of what we know, because we have access to the whole story. We kind of know Jesus, as they said, in hindsight. We know the story of Holy Week and all those events, what we call Good Friday, the crucifixion, Easter. When the disciples were initially encountering Jesus, they didn't know any of this. And when they dropped their nets and decided to follow this person with their whole beings, they really didn't know where this was headed. They simply knew there was something about him that grabbed them in their depths. Both Cynthia Bourgeault and Marcus Borg say that one of the first things we realized that we know about Jesus was that he was what they called a spirit person. He was a spirit person and a wisdom teacher. And that's going to be our focus today. What does it mean that Jesus was a spirit person and a wisdom teacher? Spirit people, we might use the term holy person, holy man, but those terms get kind of problematic. It referred to someone who reflected, possessed, embodied exceptional spiritual intuition and power, such that you could tell it by being in their presence. Now, we don't have much of a tradition of spirit people in this sense in our modern culture. It was very much a part of first century Palestine, and it's still very much a part of some other cultures in other parts of the world. For example, in India, many people from our culture who are spiritual seekers and who haven't found what they're looking for or longing for in either the churches or the organized religions that they find or have had access to here. Many people go to places like India looking for a teacher, looking for some kind of insight or wisdom. And in India, there are people who are regarded as exceptional spirit teachers. Cynthia Bourgeault says that one person after another experiences a mysterious power in Jesus that from the moment they encounter him changes the course of his or her life. Now, we probably, if we came across someone who struck us like that, we would have a tendency to be somewhat suspicious and maybe dismissive, because there have been too many examples of people who had incredible spiritual power and presence who misused it. Cult leaders, for example, are often people of exceptional spiritual power, but who have misused that power for some form of self-aggrandizement or egocentric or worse, using people with this power. And anyone who is exceptionally gifted in any regard, when you think about it, has a huge responsibility in terms of how they're going to use that exceptional gift that has been entrusted to them. Celebrity is a great power. Anyone who has that kind of platform. Well, one person, I was thinking of examples other than Jesus, just to kind of make this broader. One person that I know of who had an encounter that was life-changing and really world-changing with a spirit person in this regard is the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, who just passed away recently. Ram Dass, though, is credited with being the Westerner who in many ways brought yoga to the West in the last 50 years or so. And when we think about how much yoga has impacted our society, a lot of it goes back to this guy, Ram Dass, and the experience he had. And he was the one that kind of brought this tradition, this spiritual tradition from India over here. And it goes back to an encounter Ram Dass had when he went as a young man. He had been a professor at Harvard University. And he initially was experimenting with drugs with Timothy Leary. You've probably heard about that whole thing. Remember that in the 60s. He went to India looking for enlightenment. Long story short, he was taken to meet this one man who was regarded as a spirit person in this way. And Ram Dass had just lost his mother. And the night before he meets this spirit person, Ram Dass was out in this field looking up at the stars and thinking very much about his mother and how much he loved her and really connecting with his mother's essence in the sky, thinking about that, grieving, feeling that. And his mother had died from a spleen condition. The next day, he meets this teacher that became his primary guru. And he said that he was very suspicious of this guy initially. Was not at all predisposed to believe in this spirit person thing. But the guy looks at him and he says, last night, you were thinking about your mother. You were under the stars. Spleen. Ram Dass said, all at once, it was like all of his circuits got blown. It's like, how in the world could this guy have known that? I didn't tell anybody. And that began this journey that led to his own transformation, and he used it beautifully to serve the world. I just wanted to take a moment to say, Jesus was not the only one in this tradition. But I would say for us as Christians, we also see other things in Jesus. But this tradition of spirit people, there are people who are gifted with that degree of spiritual power and presence. And both Borg and Bourgeot say Jesus clearly was a spirit person. We'll come back to that in just a moment, but he was also a wisdom teacher. Cynthia Bourgeot says, the angle of approach I'll be using throughout this book is to see Jesus first and foremost as a wisdom teacher, a person who clearly emerges out of and works within an ancient tradition called wisdom. Wisdom is concerned with the transformation of the whole human being. Transformation from what to what? Well, for a starter, from our animal instincts and egocentricity into love and compassion. From a judgmental and dualistic worldview into a non-dual acceptingness. She says, wisdom's about transformation of the mind and the raising and awakening of one's consciousness. And wisdom teachers in Jesus' time especially tended to teach in short symbolic stories called parables. And we certainly see that throughout the Gospels. The parables were often used to actually subvert conventional wisdom. They were not just nice little stories with hidden meanings. They actually had more of a punch, usually, than that. They were deliberately used, often to shock and offend the sensibilities of someone who was listening. And the point was to open up a space for them to rethink some things, to see themselves, their world, what they'd been taught, to see it in a different way. One commentator refers to parables not as nice little stories with hidden meanings, but as spiritual hand grenades, because they were explosive. And wisdom teachers use these to kind of shock people into opening up and bringing to the surface the things that were either hidden or not obvious, even to the person themselves, so that they could be healed. And because wisdom teachers were somewhat abrupt with these explosive stories, they often got themselves into trouble with the leaders of the dominant system and conventional wisdom. Okay, so who is Jesus? First and foremost, he was a spirit person and a wisdom teacher. And we see the essence of these things in his encounter with this woman at the well. First of all, he deliberately broke the rules of his own upbringing and his own society and his own dominant culture. Number one, by choosing to go to Samaria. Jesus' people and Samaritans were basically enemies. They hated each other. They avoided each other. So who was Jesus? He was someone who refused to let his own society and his own upbringing and the conventional wisdom or anybody tell him that someone else was his enemy and not worth reaching out to or spending time with. And then when the disciples go to town and leave Jesus alone, he starts talking with a woman against the rules of his time. Men and women did not speak with each other. It was basically considered completely inappropriate for a man to talk to a woman who was not his wife and whom he did not know. So we have Jesus talking to a Samaritan woman, breaking the rules, a bit of a rebel. So who is Jesus? He was someone who was always reaching out, hanging out, speaking with, getting deep with, close to the, quote, wrong people. Now, what happens with this woman? And this is another thing that spirit people and wisdom teachers did. They got right down to the heart of things. And here's probably the most important part of my message this morning. An encounter with the Jesus of Scripture that we encounter now as the risen Jesus Christ is, in one way or another, get real time. The wisdom teacher, the spirit person, is the one who looks right into someone and lets them know without mincing words, God sees you. God knows you. In the words of the old song, your arms are too short to box with God. There's nothing about your life that's hidden. God knows. And what's so beautiful, though, Jesus goes right into it. He says to the woman, hey, by the way, go get your husband. And we don't know all the subtext. For all we know, she could have had 4 husbands, 5 husbands who were killed. And according to Jewish law, the next of kin had to take that person as a wife. It could have simply been that. It wasn't that she was somehow not a very together, mature woman. She could have been victimized 5 times over. We don't know. All we know is that it was a complicated part of her life. And so Jesus goes right there. And what's so beautiful is that there's absolutely no judgment. There's no shame. So who is Jesus? He's the one through whom God somehow lets you know that everything you have ever done, said, thought, are doing is known. In other words, the jig is up. You're busted. Pointless to play any games. It's the undoing of what happened in the Garden of Eden. The man and the woman, quote, sinned. Complicated story. We'll get into that another time. But they hid from God. And Jesus is the one who says to us, you don't need to hide from God. Number 1, you can't. God already knows. Number 2, you're loved anyway. There's a Hafiz poem. Hafiz is a Sufi mystic poet that I love that kind of gets at this. It's called Tripping Over Joy. Here's how it goes. What's the difference between your experience of existence and that of a saint? The saint knows that the spiritual path is a sublime chess game with God, and that the beloved has just made a fantastic move, that the saint is now continually tripping over joy and bursting out in laughter and saying, "I surrender." Whereas, my dear, I'm afraid you still think you have 1,000 serious moves. So who is Jesus? He's the presence of divine love that looks through us, into us, and lets us know that we are loved and accepted, and that the things that you don't want to talk about or don't want to look at or don't want to acknowledge or don't want to deal with are already known. Well, I don't want to go much further than that today. If you're sitting there thinking, well, okay, I've never had this experience with Jesus or God, I don't really know what you're talking about. First of all, let me just say that's okay. That doesn't mean that your experience has been inadequate, but it may mean that it's taken your life to get where you are right this moment. And at the risk of sounding abrupt like a wisdom teacher, I think a lot of us have not had this kind of encounter with Christ because we haven't wanted it badly enough. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they'll see God." It's absolutely fine to have a rather casual experience with God if that's what you want. But if you really want to meet the Christ that this woman at the well met, then it's probably going to require going out of your way to be open to it. Maybe committing yourself to a practice like daily meditation. Or a spiritual exercise. It's as simple as this. I invite you to try it. And that is, get off by yourself sometime and use your imagination, and imagine being at that well with Jesus. And Jesus comes to you and looks at you, and you know he sees right into the things that you don't let anybody see. What did he see? If there's a pretty quick answer to that in you, then go there and talk to him about it there. Or I had a friend named Frank Butler who used to talk about his 30-day challenge. He said, if you want to take a next step deeper into your experience with Christ, I dare you for 30 days to at some point just take a moment each day for 30 days and say, God, Jesus, if you're there and if there's more that you would like to reveal to me, please show me. Do it for 30 days. He says, I guarantee something will happen in your life, in your inner life, between you and God. I think I'll just leave it right there. I hope and pray that each of us, in our own way, in a way that feels real to us, are open to an experience of the presence of God that is different and new and powerful. on a level that we've never known before. And if you want help with that or you want to talk about that, please don't hesitate to be in touch with me.